Okay. I'm going here. If you'll give me 1 minute. Can everyone see the slideshow?
Yes.
Good.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, we had a little bit of a technological start here. Welcome, everybody. I see we have almost 30 people here, so welcome, everyone. You know, this is the BoF session on the future of trustworthiness and reliability of repositories and services. We're looking at different regimes: trust, fair, care, and core trust seal. It's brought to you by the World Data System, but in cooperation with the RDA WDS Interest Group on Certification of Repositories, which met last week. And the objectives of this session are to gain input from the community on the idea of future trustworthiness, taking into consideration the various principles that exist in a number of different regimes. We want to determine if there's a group who would like to go forward with this discussion beyond just today. This is a birds of a feather group, and determine if there are actions that might be taken. And we want to make sure we're supporting the development of the trust principles, and you'll be hearing about all of these things in due course. It comes to you because the World Data System itself is looking, based on concepts from Ben Hugo when he was a consultant to the WDS, in looking at the future of trustworthiness. Right now, the WDS requires core trust seal certification in order to be a member. But as we look at the future of trustworthiness and the increasing diversity of repositories that are interested, it brings up new concepts of aspects of trust. So we're going to have short reports from different trust regimes. We're going to start with the mother of the trust, Jonathan Crabtree, and he'll talk about the core trust seal. Then Eric Schultes will go and talk about GoFair, again in the context of trustworthiness. And then hopefully, technology God's willing, we're going to get a short excerpt, YouTube, to talk a little about care, because it was very difficult to find someone who could get to this particular session. But a short excerpt from Stephanie Carroll will introduce care principles, and we'll compare them in some ways to the FAIR principles. So that begins the discussion of how FAIR and care work together. And then Dawe will talk about trust. And following that, John and Dawe will report out on what happened last week as they're trying to develop the trust principles regime. Then we'll have a panel discussion where the panelists can talk to each other, and then we'll just open it to everyone to talk about, you know, your aspects of what you heard and the tradition, the different disciplines of trustworthiness. This is the excerpt that you're going to be hearing from. It was from a GEO meeting on indigenous data sovereignty and governance. Stephanie Carroll is the University of Arizona, and this is Stephanie in the upper right-hand corner. Maui Hudson was the moderator for the session. I'm giving you this context because we're just taking a clip out of that session, and we're going to be listening only for 3.5 minutes from the 10th minute to the 13th minute. So when we get to that, hopefully either Bridget or I will share that with you. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to turn it over to Vim.
Thanks, Bonnie. Okay, hi everybody. My name is Wim Hugo. I'm with Dance in the Netherlands at present. And Bonnie asked me to introduce some ideas around extended certification to this meeting. So on a high level, of course, as most of you would know, we have now a set of trust principles. Dawe will be expanding on that quite a bit, I'm sure, shortly. But we also have fair and care, as Bonnie has already indicated, and we will also have some additional information about that and what it means in the follow-up presentations. So if I'm a repository, I'm becoming used to the situation where we are now expected to comply with a whole range of what I would call community expectations that are worded within these principles so that we can easily understand them and to make them more accessible. And those are not the only things that the repository has to be compliant with. There are at least 3 other main groups that we've identified here at DANS that cover legal and mandatory aspects of compliance, club membership, as it were, of which the WDS is an example, because in addition to being a trustworthy repository, there may be other requirements to comply with if you want to become a member of such an initiative or a network. And then in general, there are also criteria that one might want to comply with if you are building proper digital systems, and things like security arrangements or threat protection would be an example of those. So in the worst case is that repositories will be required to engage on many fronts with many different institutions and services to verify their compliance and to understand the compliance of others. So in an ideal world, I would think that the repository would want this whole environment around compliance to be as simple as possible and to be decomplicated, as it were, to make it more workable for them. So that first dimension then of compliance, I call the motivations, the reasons why we have to be compliant. But there are other dimensions. So one of them comes from open science to say, not only do we have to think about compliance in terms of data, as many of us in the data repository environment would be doing, but open science wants us to extend such compliance to code and algorithms, to semantic artifacts, to methods and protocols, to the instruments and platforms that we share, and to some extent to our activities in the research world, things like review or serving on program committees and so on. So it's a very, very wide scope of things where some form of compliance across the board might be implicated. Yet another dimension is how we measure such compliance. There are potentially many ways of doing it, but the most suitable one from my perspective would be some maturity-based assessment of compliance. And the reason why this is so attractive is because it can be made to work for both explicitly and objectively measured elements of compliance and also ones that are measured subjectively or by humans. So something along the lines of a maturity-based compliance measurement would be a very good idea. And then the other thing that is slightly more complex to address, I know that Core Trust Seal is grappling with this, for instance, is that compliance has granularity. And there are components to things like institutions and by extension repositories that can be certified for compliance. We also have compliance that applies to data sets and their collections and the objects inside the data sets. We have record level compliance, some quality assurance mechanisms and so on. So not only do we move in a sort of an ever increasing level of granularity from institutions all the way to individual records, but within each of those levels of granularity, there are also differentiations. And of course, one would want compliance measures to be somehow to be capable of aggregation, so that, for instance, if a platform at the institution level that's being used by a repository is certified in one way or another, one can basically draw on that certification to add to the certification status of the repository that is using that platform. So we also have to deal with this granularity aspect as an additional dimension. So when I start thinking about where the gaps and overlaps are between all these, and if I look only at 3 dimensions, the community expectations on the one axis, potentially some form of assessment on whether things are essential or important or useful on another axis, and then across the aspects of open science at the bottom. Then if I look at Core Trust Seal as an example, it only deals at the moment with what one could say are criteria that are essential, because if the criteria aren't met at a certain level of maturity, it's a sort of a go or no go situation. And it also does not deal with all of the data repositories in the world, because there are some limitations in respect of what generalist repositories are able to do in respect of certification, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it means that there is a gap in the certification landscape, so to speak. If we look at the recommendations of the RDA FAIR Maturity Working Group, or their outputs, then the cover is much more comprehensive, because it looks at different levels of maturity and imperative in respect of complying with criteria, and it applies to all data, irrespective of whether it is in a repository that is discipline specific or not. So 2 major gaps already that I think is of interest to us by just looking at this very specific example is that less mature repositories are not covered in our assessments, because they may not be operating at the correct level of maturity. And then also generalist repositories are not necessarily covered when it comes to trust, as an example. So there will be many more gaps if we start elaborating this compliance space with more examples, and that's something that can help us to try and understand where to focus our efforts. So some conclusions from this very broad brush. The first thing that one could potentially think about is to develop some form of conceptual model that unifies approaches to encode, record, and query the compliance landscape. We discussed that in quite a bit more detail in the breakout earlier in RDA on November the 4th, and there is a link in the presentation to those slides. I think the second thing that one can look at as a goal is that repositories want to engage with as few structures and services as possible in trying to evaluate and manage their levels of compliance and their certifications. There will be a lot of coordination required, in my view, to develop the capabilities to fill the gaps that we can identify in this compliance landscape. And to my mind, World Data System, of course, is reasonably well placed to take on at least some of these coordination and development challenges with partners and stakeholders. And then a final thought, as I say, to keep in mind for processing while you are in the shower, is that in the future, Web3 and the concepts that people are talking about regarding the distributed and federated verification of truth and trust, surely it must have some implications for how we are going to operate in 10 years down the line. So that's maybe something to also start thinking about, is that the concept potentially of monolithic situations where trust is verified is maybe something that will come and go and will be replaced maybe with some new ideas in future. So thanks very much for the opportunity to quickly share, as I say, a very broad view of this, but hopefully it will help us to stimulate some discussions or maybe get some new insights and ideas. Thanks.
Well, Vim has laid out some challenges for the WDS in particular, and for many of you as data repository managers or people looking at these different aspects of trust. Do we have one or two questions right now? We will have time for a discussion later, but if there are questions that people have of Vim for clarifications, we can take one or two now. Anyone, just turn on your volume and microphone and ask the question or raise your hand. If I don't see any and I don't hear any, then we will go on to start hearing about some of these things in more detail. And we'll start with Jonathan Crabtree on Core Trust Seal. Jonathan, did you want to share your screen, or did you want me to share it for you?
I can share it, I think. Let's give it a shot.
Go right ahead. Thank you.
Bob Downs has his hand up.
Yep.
Oh, I'm sorry. Who does? Bob Downs?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm just have a quick question, and I'm wondering in terms of whether you see some convergence on the horizon, Vim, in terms of these efforts, something that perhaps might not be in the main focus, but is emerging as a potential opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. So I can only speak for a very small, or for a small subset of the community, but certainly for argument's sake in Europe with the European Open Science Cloud efforts, I think building some kind of unifying infrastructure where people can record compliance measurements, access information about compliance, across the board for different sets of principles and different sets of measuring techniques, different types of objects and institutions and repositories and so on. I think that's a realizable goal in the smaller environment in the EU. But whether one can then easily extend this globally, I think is a very tough proposition. Because the type of situation is very different between the different regions of the world.
Yes, it certainly is. And thank you very much. We certainly have our challenges in front of us.
Thank you. I'm sorry I had to mute. There are trains going by here. I know you heard that, and I apologize. Okay, Jonathan Crabtree, let's take it away on the Core Trust Seal.
All right, thanks, Vim. Let me try to share my screen here. All right. And can everyone see the slides now?
Yep.
Yes,
All
that's
right.
good.
All right, thank you. So it's so glad to be here today to talk about the trust and how we are approaching trust and all the components of it. Because as Bob and Vim alluded to, we got many challenges. And my personal view is that we need all hands on deck. All of our repositories need to work together. We need to figure out ways that we can address these challenges, because we're getting mandates coming down from different funding agencies and researchers that we need to work together on. So I am actually based at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in North Carolina at the Odom Institute. We run a social science research repository, so that's where my background is there, and my work is in information science. I'm currently, just recently this year, have been put in the position of the chair of the Core Trust Seal Board, representing the folks at Core Trust Seal. I have been working in this community for several years and done a little research in this community, and it is a great peer-to-peer community of volunteers, and we'll talk a little more about that as we go forward. But just to back up a little bit, why are we having all this pressure? Why are we seeing that we need these collaborations and need these infrastructure and tools that Vim was referring to? Is that we really, over the last 8 to 10 years, we have a growing recognition that there's value, that the money is in the data. The researchers need the data, and in the past, the data was held really close. Now we're starting to see this trend of open science and sharing data, and even mandates from political societal pressures to actually have accountability and transparency and verifiable science. I know that Odom's working in many areas around trustworthiness and transparency and research reproducibility. And there's many sessions here at RDA talking about that. But this idea of reuse and repurposing of data is being recognized all across the world. And many times they're being mandated. And quite often in repositories and archives feel the pressure of this. Often they're mandates, but they're unfunded mandates. So how do we fund these things, and how do we comply with these different levels of compliance if we have a very small amount of funds compared to the big research dollars elsewhere? So it is a challenge, and that is why we need to show that we're trustworthy, and do that because of the funding agencies. But how do we do that, and what's the next steps? So a little bit of a background here. There are multiple certification repository trustworthy audits that can happen. There's an ISO standard, there's an STOR seal, and of course the Core Trust seal that I'm here to talk a little bit about, but it's only one of a group of which, and they're varying levels. As we'll talk about in just a moment, the Core Trust seal is the core. It is the basic standards. That's why something on the other end as the ISO 16363 is more and more in detail. And it goes down to the more granular levels of the same principles. They're not quite the same granular levels that Vim was talking about, but they dig down into these trustworthiness principles. But the Core Trust Seal is really about that core. So where did this get started? Where did Core Trust Seal have its roots, so to speak? Well, it was rooted in RDA. RDA is where it had its beginnings, and it came from two systems that were separate. The Data Seal of Approval, which was primarily, not totally, but primarily a social science archive repository standard. And many of us, including at the Odom Archive, were Data Seal of Approval trusted repositories. And then you had the WDS certification of the regular members. And for them, they had a repository certification. And during this working group at RDA, one of the outputs was to combine that and join forces to create even more powerful, stronger, and overarching Core Trust Seal that would encompass all of those, and at the same time bring those two communities together, which was pretty fabulous. And that's where this came from. And now we have what we now see as the Core Trust Seal that replaced these two. So the idea of the Core Trust Seal is to safeguard the data, to ensure the highest quality and a guide to managing that data into the future. So we are supporting repositories, enabling data consumers to get good, trustworthy data, and its ability for the funding agencies to say, place this data in a trustworthy repository. And it gives these producers some assurances that their data and all the information needed to understand it into the future, sometimes even for themselves, to be able to understand this in a reliable manner as it's going forward. So this is not a one-time thing, it is an ongoing process. And that involves lots of components, because you've got to understand not only the designated community, the users that need to actually leverage that data into the future, but you need to understand the technology in order to do migrations or edit the data or change formats as things move forward, so it's still usable by the community that it's needed for. So the initiative, there's some confusion out there, since there are things like the ISO standard that's more detailed. In this case, the Core Trust Seal is a not-for-profit, community-based, as I said, strong ties with RDA. It's domain agnostic. It doesn't matter what the domain is. It can be anything from physical sciences to social sciences to linguistics, all different types. And it is a global. It is more than 100 Core Trust Seal repositories around the world. I mentioned this idea of not-for-profit and community-based because this is a peer review system. Basically, you are asking your peers, are you trustworthy? That is the root of this. It's not a corporate, it's not a for-profit group where you pay for a certification. It is a peer-to-peer system where we share and work with each other to ensure we're trusting each other. So it's a two-step process. They're spaced on 16 requirements plus R0. I consider that 17. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But it's a self-assessment where you can look at other guidance from other repositories. You can compare how you would answer these 16 or 17 questions. And then those answers are presented to 2 other repositories. So these 2 experts that are independent reviewers come from other peers. So it's basically your peers have volunteered. And once you become a Core Trust Seal repository, you are expected to put forth a reviewer. So someone in your organization will review the next person. So that's how the system is sustainable, is because we help out each other. There are a small set of administrative fees. It's €1,000 every 3 years. So about basically 333 euros a year to help maintain like the websites and to keep the tools running and to keep the minimal set of administration fees moving forward. But the real work are by the peers who volunteer to review each other, by the gracious support of all the board members who go through each and every one of these repositories and work through making sure that we can trust all this effort. We have varying levels of expertise, which is good because we share with each other and we learn from each other. So the peer review system is 2 experts, 2 independent peers review it independently. Those 2 go back to the board and the board reviews those and adds board comments. And if they see any inconsistencies there, then it goes back to the actual repository to make changes or edits. And often there's 2 and 3 versions. This is not a one, usually it's not a one-time situation. And that takes a lot of effort and time. And it's reviewed on a basis where everyone agrees. So the 2 experts and the board all agree that it's a trustworthy repository and all the efforts have been made to fulfill these requirements, and then it moves forward. So I talked about these 16 requirements. I won't go into detail for these. We can always do that at another time, but there are categories for these requirements. The first is the background information, R0, as I was saying. So there's 16 requirements, but R0 is very important. It basically talks about the type of repository you are, that background information. As Vim mentioned earlier, we're seeing more and more generous repositories looking for a place to be certified. As where in the past, early on, it was the domain repository, like a social science repository or a geophysics repository. Now we're starting to see more of the generous repositories, and there are challenges there. And in R0, we find out what those challenges are. Things like curation. What type of curation do they do? How do they handle their data coming in? What types of users do they have? Who are their designated community? Who are they targeting? And if they have an archive that's multiple pieces, are they only certifying a certain portion or all of it? So those are important questions that all rolled into that R0. But then you go into the organizational infrastructure, things like mission statements. Do you have a mission that is geared towards long-term preservation? Those questions, things like, how do you handle sensitive data, rights management, those things that are tied into organizational infrastructure. Those are in that R1 through R6 requirements. And then you have the digital object management, which is actual taking care of that digital object. And since we're domain agnostic, those digital objects could be a PDF file, or they could be a tabular file. In my case, at our archive, it would be some sort of statistics data, tabular files, R files, or comma delimited files, or it could be an image file, or it could be a recording, any of those things. So those digital objects, there are different types of management techniques for different types of objects. So all of the, how you manage those objects, how do you ensure that they don't change? How do you use checksums, for example, or assign DOIs to be sure they can be discovered and differentiated between all the different versions of those and changes. So how you manage those digital objects are all wrapped up into this R7 through R14, as well as preservation and your preservation strategies and things like that. And of course, technology underlies a lot of these things. I like to think that the R15 and R16 are last because they underpin everything, but they're not the most important. Actually, oftentimes it's in this organizational infrastructure or the digital object management that's the hardest things to do. Technology sometimes is the easy part. It's the other part that is most important. So, and then there's applicant feedback on the process. And we always continually get feedback and try to adapt all through the life cycle of the Core Trust Seal. We actually review, and as part of the mission is to review those standards every so many years. And since you have to get renewed, you may be renewing against a new standard. So for example, in 2022, during that year, we will be taking all the feedback from our members and taking those folks, taking input and meeting and thinking about how we might need to amend or change or do efforts to change that standard to be sure it fits with the new needs of the community moving forward. So that's going to happen over 2022, and we will be seeing a new version coming out after that. Sometimes there are major changes, sometimes not. So in the Vim talked about granularity, and that it's a really important because at the Core Trust Seal, we are more of a high level. So some of these compliance levels are very, they're not as detailed as, for example, some of the things, the tools that he was talking about might do. In some cases, it goes not applicable, just not applicable at all. But you really have this idea of the repository has not considered this and we're just thinking about it, or they have a theoretical concept, or they're in the implementation phase, or they're fully implemented. So in many cases, you can say, well, I am working on a preservation strategy and I have this theoretical concept, but I haven't made it there yet. That's a level 2. That affects the trustworthiness of that repository. It may be a case where you have a fully fleshed out, really nice preservation strategy and you've only implemented part of it, but you're working towards implementing the rest of it and working towards that 3 to 4. So there's an idea that over time, as you get recertified, you will be getting better. The idea is help each other get better. We all know that we're not perfect to start with. So very often everything is not always all 4s to start with. So we're working our way through that process, and you can get certification as a trustworthy repository, even if some of the requirements are at level 3, because we know that we're always looking to continuously improve. So that's the idea of peer helping each other get better and better. So there's lots of resources to help out here. That we have extended guidance, there's webinars, there's training stuff that can help people. Even if you don't get certified against the Core Trust Seal, it's a great set of resources to go build your repository, to think about what you need to be trusted. If you would like to apply, of course, we'd love to have you apply for certification, but you can use these in order to make your repositories better and think through planning. And we always encourage people when they're starting to build a repository, they'll look at what other repositories have done. Everything is on our website as far as the certified repositories, and all of their answers to all the other previous questions. So you can look at the groups who have come before you and see how they have answered these questions or how they have solved these problems. And it's very helpful, especially for archives as they move forward. So other than that, I'm happy to take questions now or later, and I'll turn it back over to you, Bonnie.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. So talking about granularity, you're talking at the institutional, at the repository level. We're now going to turn to Eric, who's going to talk about FAIR data at the data level. So this begins to put together some of this conceptual model and the blocks that are missing that Vim showed us earlier. So Eric, share your screen.
Yeah, hi, Bonnie. Thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation to participate today. And indeed, I'm coming from the Go Fair Foundation on this, and that's, that's the environment where I've spent the last few years of my life. And it's for me, and this is an opportunity now to think a little bit more deeply about how FAIR might relate, FAIR principles might relate to the trust principles and also to the care principles. And my first thoughts were, it could be that these principles are completely orthogonal to each other and maybe completely independent of each other. And in fact, I have a slide where I kind of emphasize over the last couple of years when I talk about the FAIR principles, I really emphasize that they're for machine actionability, and whether or not they are trustworthy or whether or not they are used in ethical ways is really orthogonal to FAIR. That being said, it might be that there are still ways that these principles will interconnect and maybe even synergize with each other. And so just a short presentation today to try and explore that idea. And so I'm going to start by going through, kind of the basics of the FAIR principles. This is how I would generally introduce FAIR when I encountering audiences that are new to this. So the first thing I always mention is that FAIR really is about automating these FAINR functions. So despite the egalitarian tone of the acronym, it's really about this kind of computer science level operation or action. The other thing about FAIR is that you see metadata everywhere. And it's not just metadata, but it's, to be fair, it's really asking for machine actionable metadata. So that it gets a bit recursive here. It's the metadata should themselves be examples of FAIR data. They should have identifiers, they should be registered, etc. This is often a tricky task. So we've launched in Go Fair metadata for machine workshops where we can help groups to kind of jumpstart their FAIR metadata when they're ready. The other thing I like to point out about the FAIR principles, because it comes up then later on when you try to implement, is kind of this partitioning between principles that are in general better to be handled by infrastructure components from principles that are in general much better to be handled by domain experts. So kind of separating out the real computer science from the data science in this. And here, the red is for the infrastructure, blue is for the domain content. And it's, I think the most wonderful thing about the FAIR principles is R1.3, where there's this very explicit call out to domain relevant community standards. So in principle, we wouldn't even be able to do FAIR without the role of the domain experts. And so that's sort of like this overview of FAIR, but then for audiences that are really new to this, I often like to contrast to what FAIR is not, or maybe some misconceptions around FAIR. So FAIR is not a standard, but in fact, many standards can be used to implement FAIR. So then it becomes a kind of, a set of implementation choices one has to make. FAIR is not only semantic web or linked data. This is often conflated. FAIR is not equal to open or to free. And maybe this is already getting us a little bit closer to the trust principles or the care principles. It's not that FAIR doesn't care about open. It's just that not all data can be made open. So patient records, for example, incredibly useful for research, but will never be made open. And FAIR allows for that possibility. FAIR is also not only for repositories But as Bonnie said in the introduction, in fact, it's for, we say the fair data principles, but it's really, in principle, fair can be applied to any digital object. So any kind of machine actionable unit of information could be sort of regarded under the FAIR principles. All of that being said, this is maybe the real take-home message from today on my presentation. I always like to emphasize to my audiences that by design, FAIR explicitly left out data quality, trustworthiness, responsibility, ethics, etc. And these are questions I often get from audiences like, oh, what about ethics? What about responsibility? Should we add letters to FAIR? And the thinking here when the principles were designed was these issues are often contextual, and what might be high data quality in one context could be low data quality in another context. So just regarding this, can the machine understand what it sees and take action on it? That these elements were not needed to be there explicitly, and they were left out. However, it is believed that by rendering your data increasingly fair and having rich metadata, machine actionable metadata, describing where this comes from, how it was made, we think that we can better infer trustworthiness or data quality than we could in, let's say, ordinary non-fair type data sets. So it's there, but only implicitly. And then just a couple more things, and I'll try to relate it to trust and care. We have had some success in recent years with this idea of a fair implementation profile. And this is really a very practical way to help organizations, communities, to implement FAIR. It's a very practical approach where you can really kind of assess where you are now and where you want to get to and what those gaps might be. And it's really a kind of a questionnaire based on the FAIR principles, asking you to get your implementation choices. And this is very close to the idea of FAIR maturity indices and trying to get a handle on that in a quantitative way. So I'm showing a nice example here from EOS Nordics, where in a very systematic approach, 100 repositories or so were systematically assessed for each of the FAIR principles. Sort of a tour de force and very interesting outcome. But in turn, this is one step removed from the idea of actually being able to, in an automated, objective way, to certify FAIR implementations. And at GoFair, we've launched a pioneer program where we're working with early movers to try and define what FAIR certification could look like. And we had a virtual site datacon meeting a couple of weeks ago, and I have links here if you're interested in following that discussion on certification. So then lastly, I come to the trust principles and to the care principles. And without trying to answer any of these questions, I just want to kind of use the same syllogism that we've used for the FAIR principles and apply it to these other sets of principles to see if there might be some kind of overlap or intersection to how we conceptualize this. So, like with FAIR, it was very handy to ask, well, what is properties that would constitute non-FAIR data? I would ask, are there ways that we can identify non-trustworthy data or examples of repositories that are somehow failing at trust, maybe even in spurious ways, in nefarious ways? And would those be nice counterexamples for us to better understand the trust principles and how to implement? Is there an infrastructure versus domain-specific component to this? If we wanted to think about measuring or certifying trust maturity, would that have something to do with the metadata in that repository? And would that metadata be easier to analyze if it were itself FAIR? And then, if we want to find widespread implementations of trust principles, is there a way that we can define a trust implementation profile? And then the analogous questions again for the care principles. I'm not sure the first question would really apply here. I think it would be pretty clear what we mean by care. But would there be infrastructure versus domain-specific components to this? I think so. Can metadata play a role in care? And in fact, can FAIR metadata help to synergize the care principles? And again, would there be a care implementation profiles possibility? And with that, I would like to say thank you and farewell.
Well, thank you, Eric. You are you did exactly what I asked you to do, and that is to think about FAIR and to see how it relates to some of these other domains. So we'll have more conversation about that shortly.
And happy to comply, Bonnie.
There you go. There you go. I mean, these are the beginnings of the discussion, all these things that Eric pointed out in the relationship, and I've taken a few notes, but I will hold off. The next thing is a little experiment because it was very difficult to have someone to present care in this context at this time. So it was hard to find someone, but the people that are most involved in care have done lots of talking and have sent me things, and we've taken a clip out of a presentation given by Stephanie Carroll. I mentioned this at the beginning, but a number of other people have joined since then, which actually does a little bit of a relationship between the care, it presents the care principles, and then the relationship between care and FAIR in some ways. So this is another little piece of this puzzle that we're trying to do. Bridget, do you want to try? This is bringing a video into this, and my technology, I haven't done this before. So Bridget, if you're there, otherwise I'll try and do it.
Yeah, no, I'm here. Okay. If you want me to, I'll go ahead, shall I, and try?
And share screen. We're starting at the 10-minute mark and going to the 13.5-minute mark. So please, Bridget.
Okay.
And this is just to introduce the care principles for those of you who don't know, and then a little bit of relationship, but ultimately at the bottom line, the care principles really represent not only the indigenous people interests, but broadly, and you'll hear that. Okay, thanks, Bridget.
Yeah, you're saying thanks, but unfortunately it looks like I don't know how it works. Okay, can you all see the video?
Yep.
Let's see if this...
In many other areas across the globe. The Global Indigenous Data Alliance, or GIDA, is an international network of networks that promotes Indigenous control of Indigenous data.
Is this okay, Bonnie? Is this the right point?
Yes,
okay.
It'll in 1 minute. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Enforcing the rights to engage in decision-making in accordance with Indigenous values and collective interests. Released by GIDA, the care principles, collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, and their sub-principles set forth critical considerations for non-tribal data creators, stewards, and users, and are designed to guide the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in data governance across contemporary data ecosystems. The care principles bring a people and purpose orientation to data governance, which complements the data-centric nature of the FAIR principles, which are findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. The care principles shift the focus of data governance from consultation to values-based relationships. The care principles are designed to be complementary to the FAIR principles to promote equitable participation and outcomes from data access, use, reuse, and attribution in contemporary data landscapes. Implementation of the care principles should be seen as a dimension of open and fair data that ensures the use of data is purposeful and enhances the well-being of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous data should be both fair and care. Currently, the vast majority of Indigenous data are neither fair nor care. In the critical era of open data, big data, and open science, Indigenous collections and data can be hard to find. They can be buried in larger collections, data sets, or repositories, and Indigenous data are often mislabeled, not properly attributed, and not searchable. Thus, Indigenous collections and data are not fair and do not perpetuate Indigenous provenance, protocols, or purpose. There's concern about implementing FAIR and care on already existing data, as well as instituting policies and practices to operationalize fair and care in the ongoing creation of new data. So we want to address both the volumes of data that already exist, as well as the vast volume of data that is created every single day. Important currently used mechanisms that can reflect and enact the CARE principles include tribal data governance tools such as tribal codes, guidelines, and research review processes. Also, items that show relationships between institutions, so data sharing, memorandums of understanding, and other types of agreements, and other institutional policies and procedures such as policies that the federal government or universities or research repositories set out. Labels and notices, which are mechanisms for Indigenous communities to engage with cultural and research institutions to manage their rights over property and knowledge, are also another type of tool. But more tools are needed, as well as methods to assess and evaluate how these other institutions are enacting the CARE principles. There's much work to be done. Importantly, CARE needs to be applied across the data life cycle through laws, institutional policies, and ethical changes, and in durable changes to data infrastructures that persist throughout the data lifecycle. I encourage you to listen to the other talks and lightning talks to learn more about data and research governance efforts related to Indigenous data sovereignty. Thank you and have a great day.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. She fit very well into our conversation today. And as I was watching these things and thinking about it, Indigenous data is important as we're looking at solving global problems. There's a lot of Indigenous data in biodiversity, in biomedicine, and things like that that somehow have to be interoperable and have to have trustworthy and brought into the main line of data management and data interoperability. But this also, the CARE principle, in addition to the type of data, brings in the whole ethical context. It's a new dimension for thinking about data. It's the cultural and ethical context, and do repositories take into consideration these kinds of things? So I think that's a new added dimension, and thank you, Vim, for bringing that in as that dimension. And so the last thing, we'll now turn to Daiwei, and we will learn more about what they're trying to do in trust. And I am going to share my screen for Daiwei. So if you'll give me 1 minute, I will share. Okay.
Yeah, I can see the slide. Yeah, great.
Go, Daiwei. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Bonnie. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so maybe you can go to the directly to the next slide. It is very exciting. I think this is the first RDA session that I can remember to talk about 3 principles at the same session. So I want to introduce trust principles a little bit, but also want to understand the trust from the perspective of understanding the interactions with other principles. And on the right of the screen, that box is one of my dreams for the open science, which is the open science is always usable for everybody. And then the CARE principles care about the community, the ethics of it. And the FIRE principles are about usability. And I think Eric clarified that really well, but I think I want to mention that the usability is really on the, is for in the eyes of users. Like sometimes usability can be defined differently. And then the policies and directives are to make data open. So on top of that, and the trust principles is to provide guidance for repositories to have a dependable operations to sustain the desirable outcomes mentioned previously for the long term. And that's I think what the trust principle is about. Next slide.
Oops, sorry. Yep.
Yeah, so while we're often noticing the excitement, the achievement from the open sciences, we may not always look the dark side of data, like the dark repositories, and there's only 12% of the data are in the repositories, and the others risk loss. And also there is 80% of the repositories disappears for various reasons. So to avoid the losing data, that we need a trustworthy operations, which trust principles is advocate for. Next slide.
I'm trying to get it to the next slide. Sorry, go.
Okay, great. Yeah. So in the past decades, there is, especially in space and social sciences, there is a lot of good work for improving quality of the trustworthiness of the repositories. However, many of them are not well known or easily understood by the people outside data preservation communities. And then trust principles is trying to change that through a concise and a straightforward message. And like the FAIR principles, the trust principle is not trying to replace any standards, because they're not. And also not to change the criteria or best practices. Instead, is to provide the high-level starting point for advocating, supporting, and implementing all the certifications that for mature repositories and assessments for all repositories. So it's really as a kind of a tool to let people think about trustworthiness and talk about it and get understand the importance of the trustworthy repository play a role in the data ecosystem. And next slide. And so here is the trust principles, is another set of acronym, and T for transparency. The transparency is really the foundation of the trust. And without transparency, you will not have the trust. And the key things in the transparency is that the repository will provide verifiable and public evidence for people to know what they're doing. And R for responsibility is the action to fulfill the commitment to ensure the authenticity and integrity of data holdings. And this step will require people play a role that to provide to enforce our compliance standards and provide the interfaces, tools, and have processes and workflows and all that elements in order for them to make sure they can fulfill the responsibilities. And then user focus is the center of the trust principles, is need to provide what the user wants. And I should mention that the trust principles is not guarantee that the repositories provide the fair data, because that may not be what the user wants. You know, there are some repositories serve as some private reasons, so they may not be need to be fair, or sometimes like fair data can be too expensive to implement it. You know, for the legacy historic data, that may not be a proper way to do it. But I think the trust principle want the repositories to listen to users, and not their current need, but also their evolving need, and then to satisfy it. If they need open data, they provide open data. If they need the fair data, they provide fair data. And if it is need to be accessed by everybody, and then the repository should be doing their best to do that. So I think the user focus is the connection between the fair data, fair principles, and the care principles. And then sustainability is to have a mechanism to sustain the services and preserve the data holding for the long term. And then technology is to provide infrastructure and capabilities to support the repository operations. And the next slide. So as I mentioned, the trust is really built on top of a lot of good work have been done previously, and this is a summary of the various literatures that the work has been done for each of the 5 letters. And next slide. So the trust principles are gaining momentum, and more people are talking about it. But this is still a long way for the trust principle to achieve its goal to build a robust repository ecosystem. And I list a couple of challenges that I heard from other colleagues to talk about it. And I think one is there is good that trust principles have some concrete implementations like the certification standards, but majority of them are pursued by the domain-specific repositories. And can you still hear me okay, Bonnie? And then the
Yes, we can hear you. I'm sorry. Yes, we can hear you. Fine.
Yeah, sorry. And so the domain repositories and some of the institutional repository may not address the scalability problem because there are a lot of data generated. And how do we deal with that needs? And so how trust principles can help with bridging that type of gaps. And also we want the people understand trust principles in their own language, in their specific disciplines. And right now there is only a small number of certified repositories out of the existing repositories. So we may not have enough critical mass to provide examples that how trust principles are implemented. I should mention that the Cultural Seal have one advantage is that it will publish all the certification materials online publicly. And so like for 100-some Cultural Seal certified repositories already provide a knowledge base of different type of implementations, but I think they still need that to consolidate them, to generalize them, and to provide the guidance to young repositories and other repositories are willing to increase their trustworthiness. And then the third one, I think Wim has already talked about in his talk. There is a lot of concepts and they're overlapping, and what are the principles, what other practices, and how they're different. I think we need a clear landscape map to tell people what they want, what the concern they have. So we need the clarifications of the concept and languages in order for people to communicate. And then the last but not least is the trust, like other principles, need to have people work together. They often from the different perspectives, and in order for the whole community improve the robustness of the ecosystem, and people need to work together to get the things done. Next slide. So basically, I want to summarize what I just talked about. I think trust principles is a mnemonic tool to help people understand the trustworthiness of the data repositories. And also trust principles is evolving as the landscape of the repository ecosystem evolves. And next slide. So on the roadmap and the trustworthy, the trust principles has been released and is at the stage of actively engaging with the community and to explore what are the ways that the trust principle can impact the implementations, or maybe the maturity at different levels. So I think on November 4th session, we are posting the question, like, what is the mechanism that we is good for us to still actively improving trust principles for the community? Is that the working group, or maybe some other mechanisms? I guess like we're going to talk about later. And next slide. And I just want to acknowledge trust principles has been a great community effort on the RDA for the last 2 years, and there's a lot of diverse contributors. And also, I want to mention that there is a very informal trust implementation groups. Like we meet like bi-weekly and just discuss various issues. And I hopefully, like, follow the discussions, we can find a way to forward, involve as many people as we can to move the trust principle forward with other principles. So that's it. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I had to get my microphone back on. Thank you very much. And we begin to say, I will say RDA is really doing its job, because this whole thing started with RDA and WDS working together because there were two trust requirement systems, and they created the core trust seal. And we have now reunited where we started with RDA and WDS in looking at this interest group. And so there was an interest group activity last week, and there was the WDS Birds of a Feather this week, and we found out how much we had in common. So we're going to go forward together with the interest group. And to that, Daiwei or John Petters, do either of you want to just take 1 minute or two as to what happened last week and the continuation into this week? Or shall we just go into open discussion? Do you want to give 1 or 2 minutes on that?
I'll just talk really quick. So hi, everybody. John Petters. I'm one of the co-chairs for the Certification of Digital Repositories interest group. And our 2 sections, the Birds of a Feather that we're in right now, and the session that we convened in November 4th, very much aligned, very much looking at similar issues. We were focusing a little bit more, as Dawei just said, on how do we implement the trust principles. But really the larger question is, we have all these principles frameworks, we have certification processes that are already established. How are all these things related? And I think I thought was really fun about what we just heard is everybody's initial ideas from all of our speakers. They're not wildly divergent on how these things are related, but they're not the same. They don't talk about it the same way. The relationships are not discussed exactly the same way. So there certainly seems to be an interest and trying to have a better understanding of how things are related. And that's our session was on this as well. The one thing I really add that wasn't discussed here, a lot of similar discussion is similar. One thing we will add is that we had discussions and presentations from the other repository certification providers, Nestor and ISO 16363. And they both had concerns. They both laid out concerns of having their established certification processes being kind of maybe pushed to the side a little bit by the fact that these trust principles exist. And maybe we'll have repositories and data providers start saying, well, I aspire to the trust principles, so I'm a trustworthy repository, where they in fact haven't gone through a certification process or looked at things more rigorously. And that concern was also put out. So that's another concern about how do we have all these things related, these principles frameworks, these processes, these metrics related that Vim already laid out a framework for. So, and I think Dawi just said having a working group around this within RDA there could be real benefits to doing so. Vim mentioned that there might be some funding within Europe, the European, within EISC for this kind of thing, but having global input on these kind of efforts that RDA has a good forum to do so might well be a good choice. So I'll stop talking there.
Okay, well, I have a couple of observations I'm going to start, and then we'll just go into some open conversations. We can look at the chat. I've been working technology and not looking at chat, so we can look at those in a minute. But two things emerged for me. One is the global model that Vim put out, the multidimensional chart that shows where the gaps and things are, and the trust principles, which is also trying to unite them, how these might be working together and how closely and where we can go with that. The other thing that occurred to me is when Eric was talking, he said metadata for machines are the essence of the GoFair initiative and fair data, because you want the machine to be able to do it. So imagine we have this little NoBot, okay? And the NoBot can eat up all the data and figure it out. NoBot, by the way, is a concept that was in the 90s or early 2000s that we don't talk about anymore. But this little NoBot eats up the data, but then it hits a repository. Now, how does the NoBot know the repository is a fair repository or trusted repository? So it knows that the data it has just eaten is from a trusted place and handled in a trusted way over some sustainable period. So how do we start linking these kinds of things so that things are truly interoperable and the machine interoperable to the extent that the machines can understand them? And then how do you add in the cultural dimension, which when will machines ever understand? So I think we have the beginnings of some really interesting explorations here. And with that, if there's something somebody wants to jump in that was put in the chat that they'd like to vocalize now, or how do we want to do the conversation? I see Karen Payne's hand up. Go, Karen.
Yep. Hi, Bonnie. First of all, really, there's my camera again. Really great session. So congratulations to the organizers and to the speakers. That was really, really engaging, and I appreciate that. I wanted to circle back to something that Vim had said in his opening talk. His matrix three-dimensional diagram I thought was really interesting. But one of the things that he said was that he was looking, at least in the European context, about setting up an infrastructure to be able to record the certifications or adherence to these principles by certain services. And I wondered if he was talking about a separate infrastructure. It seems to be captured as part of the catalog of services in the e-infra standard that's being used, but by OpenAIRE and CATRIS and the European Open Science Cloud and others, and that would be also machine readable. So, a tag or an entryway into the catalog, talking about the certification of that service. And I'm wondering if that's sort of what he's thinking of. Hi, Vim.
Hi, Karen. Yeah, so just briefly, yes. So in EOSC, we're looking at the opportunity to establish what we call a compliance graph that extends the information that's available about the catalog of services. Initially, that compliance graph service is not really aimed at trust or fair or any other set of compliance. It's more to do with the rules of EOSC and what services must comply with to be part of EOSC. But we are also looking independently of that effort on how to extend that compliance service to also be able to record fair compliance for individual objects, trust compliance for individual repositories, and so on and so forth. So we're hoping to make it much more principle agnostic, if you will, to say that the ideal of being able to go to a single place, or at least conceptually, have the same kind of queries to different places to determine compliance status of all kinds of objects and services would be a very lofty ideal if we can achieve it.
Well, another thing, Vim, that you've talked about before is not from the point of view of the user, but the point of view of the director of a repository. When he wants to, or she wants to make sure their repository is trustworthy in all of the different aspects of trustworthiness that we have been discussing. Okay, so how do we make it easy for this repository director who has a lot of work to do to serve his or her community, and yet now there are all these things that they have to do to be able to say, yes, you can trust me, and then various funding agencies will want to know, well, are you this, that, and the other? So how do we help the repository director? That's a really interesting question, because if we can help them, we can also help the user.
Yeah, so just briefly, there are these sets of use cases, I suppose, that one can assign to different stakeholder groups. So repository managers and operators would be one, the end users would be another, the researchers, for instance, the funders would be another important one, and so on. And each of them wants a different slice or perspective on the compliance space. But it will be very useful if they all use the same API specifications, for argument's sake, to encode, record, and query all kinds of compliance. And for that, as Dawe has pointed out, one needs to start trying to eliminate the overlaps and confusion and ambiguities in the language that we use. You know, what is a principle, and how does that relate to criteria and metrics, and what are benchmarks, and how are they different from recommendations or best practices? So there's lots of conceptual disambiguation work to do if we want to start making progress with that.
Okay, do we have any other topics that you'd like
Bonnie,
to address to the panelists? Yes, Sally.
Bonnie, I want to add some comments to the question you asked earlier. I think they have two sides of the question. One is the repository operators, and the other is founders. And I think I also want to explain the difference of trustworthy and trusted repositories. So the trustworthy is, I think, from the repository perspective to show others, I have done all this, I'm trustworthy. But trusted is a decision that the stakeholder make, like, do I want to trust you or not? I saw all the evidence. Do I want to invest in you or not? So that's kind of the two sides of the coin. So then from the founder's perspective, it's very easy to accept the principles. There's high level things that they can understand. They will not understand like a lot of details, like what's the technical implementations. That is not what the founder is actually supposed to do, is what the expert's supposed to do. And so then I think in order for the repository to increase their trustworthiness, with from to create their perspective, like they need to be trusted, is to really kind of get down to the discussion about the implementations, which I think for the trust principles, the advantage is already standards out there people have working on for like decades. And so I think there's need some pathway we need to build, like, like from the principles that everybody can understand to the implementations the expert can evaluate. So currently I feel we still have that gap. And so then I think the question is not, I think for the repository, probably like some of the repository don't have to have a certification in order to prove they're trustworthy. I think they know what they're doing, but they are not socialized enough that that people can understand their interoperation. So I'm thinking, if like RDA is a place that we're trying to bridge that gap.
Yeah, that's another dimension of granularity from the high level to the lowest implementation level, in addition to what kind of level in the structure, whether you're talking about the data or the repository themselves or a network of repositories, you know, at what level of granularity are you talking? So anyone want to comment on that? Any of the other speakers? The funder's view versus the operator's view, and how do we get from one to the other in a way that is useful? Any comments? Have you been thinking about how to do that? You know, have you started that journey, Dawe, between the funders and the implementers? I see Eric wants to say something.
Yeah, actually, I will just quickly talk. I think the NIH actually just released a funding opportunities that we found 17 repositories, like for to have this supplement and to evaluate what their fairness, you know, what are the trustworthiness and what the metrics they have been using. So they hopefully, like, this is a kind of a year money, and then let them to figure out what are the commonalities of the, you know, the way they're increasing their operations and satisfy their users, and mainly, like, you know, the fairness, and then that's kind of language that we're trying to build for the biomedical community, and that's kind of that's one effort that we are doing. But this is kind of just a more like NIH centric, and I think it'll be good, like, you know, like all other disciplines will do the same, and then we'll have a better understanding of data.
Have the repositories been selected, or is there going to be a competition to be selected to get money?
The first round we have already selected, like there were 17 awardees, and we'll see how that's going. And then maybe next year, we'll, if it is going well, we may, you know, support additional repositories. But the first round has completed.
Okay, I think Eric wants to say something about the question and the answer. Eric, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm muted. So most common word on the internet these days. I'm on mute. Sorry. The question you asked, you know, about the kind of the motivations that you can give to funders versus motivations that you might give to the researchers or to the data producers. On one hand, there is maybe sometimes the idea that these would be necessarily conflicting, in the sense that the funder may require something of the data producer, and then the data producer feels it as a burden and maybe even a distraction from what they do. On the other hand, I don't think this necessarily needs to be the case. And thanks to COVID, we've had a number of projects in the last year and a half now in the GoFair space, where we've worked pretty closely with some funding agencies, the Dutch funder Zone and Vey in particular, and we've launched the metadata for machine workshop approach pretty heavily with the COVID program, and also their infectious disease and antimicrobial resistance programs. So there's about, well, close to 200 research projects now that are creating their FAIR metadata for this. And it is, you know, I think we were able to find some solutions or methods that made sense. And, you know, it took work and it took money and it took time, but it made sense to both the funder and to the data producer. And, you know, I don't know if this continues, you know, after COVID or into other programs, but I think for the moment here, we really established a really beautiful collaboration between the researchers and these 200 projects and these new requirements for fairness coming from the funder. And yeah, I don't think these things necessarily need to be antagonistic. And so my question then is, yeah, I wonder how this would relate also to trust and care principles.
Okay, you're wondering, does anyone want to? David, we have Francois and David. I don't know if you're commenting on what Eric is asking, but David first and then Francois.
Francois, are you commenting directly on what Eric just said?
I would like to just to say very briefly, to repeat something which was said before, but if we take Core Trust Seal, it's a way to improve the way you are working, to study and to assess your own capacity to fulfill the criteria. So it's not only linked to the founder's mandate or whatever, it's also if you want to work as well as possible. So I don't see competition with founder, a fight between founders and repositories on that, simply because I hope all repositories want to improve the way they are working.
That's a fair point, that we're not only doing it for the money, that a lot of the center directors are doing it because that is part of their scientific purpose. So David, please.
Well, I just one other observation, and I suppose this is kind of throwing the cat in amongst the birds, but certainly from the standpoint of supporting the efforts of the WDS, I'm reminded of our parent organization, the ISC, and the work that's being done on looking at the possibility of having alternate publication models that arise. But that leads me to want to close that thought loop, because there are certainly some transformation deals being made by large publishers with countries that have obviously national funders, scientific enterprise, repositories, and other interests. And yet some of the major commercial publishers are also interested in their own version of certification from the standpoint of understanding whether or not the scientific results that they publish are based on data that is indeed can be vouchsafed for having integrity and that it is abiding by these other sorts of principles. So I think that it sort of depends on where you fall on issues around evolving publication models. But I think it's really important for thinking about the future of certification and the small t trust sort of conceptions that it's based upon, to recognize that there is actually a very large driver of interests that it will be communicating directly with national governments and national funders, and could have an interesting effect on the work that is being undertaken by people here on this RDA BoF session.
So I would say how the funding community is or is not involved in a lot of these things is an interesting dimension that we've started to open up. I see we're at the witching hour. I guess the last 15 minutes just went by very, very quickly. So I think we need to close. And let me just say that the RDA WDS, the interest group that's existing, wants to continue this discussion. So anybody who's interested, Dawei, maybe you can put or John, put a note in the chat on how people can register an interest for this if you want to continue the discussion through that interest group. And then from the WDS perspective, we will be considering how we factor trust into our strategic planning, how we're going to continue dealing with core trust seal in the future. And from the repository data center management point of view, how do we help rationalize this to make their lives both easier and, as Francois said, to make sure that in fact they're reaching their own scientific purposes. So do we have a final word from Dawei, John, or anyone else? I guess we can hang in a few more minutes, but Dawei, John, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, and I think this is Dawei. I think this is a great session. I think the one observation that I is very encouraging to see the great interest for people to know and understand about trustworthiness. I think probably we should continue this discussion. And I saw John just put the link of the interest group in the chat.
Okay, and you can write to WDS-IPO, and I'll put it in the chat at utk.edu if you want to jump in and you're a member of WDS and would like to participate within the context of the WDS. With that, do we have any final burning comments that anybody would like to make? David, your hand, yep, you've taken your hand down. Any burning comments? If not, I'm going to put that email in the chat. I see there are a lot more messages that I'm trying to get to. Okay, so here is the address if you want, if you're a WDS member or are interested in becoming a WDS member and would like to further discussion through WDS, then I'll put that address in the chat. I got to remember my address. There you go. And if not, if we have no other comments from anyone, the notes will be available. I've captured the chats and all the things, and I think we have them all put in the chats anyway. I think people have been very helpful in doing that. If you haven't already put your name in case we have anything to follow up on, make sure you go to the session link and put your name up. Okay, with that,